one show after another, and I just couldn't stop. And I kept hearing, we got to have protein. We got to have, like, wow, if there was ever an endorsement. So the data on protein is very interesting. The standard protein requirement is 0.8 grams per kilogram per day. 0.8. Right? It's not 1.2, it's not 2 grams per pound, right? According to bodybuilders. None of that stuff is real, because all of that stuff is going to filter through your kidneys and it's going to destroy your kidneys. So what's the data? It's very interesting is if you restrict somebody's protein, by the way, this is back in 2009, it was a meta-analysis, and what they found was that if you could get somebody to go down to 0.6, what you would find is that their risk of death would go down by 32% simply by putting them on a low protein diet. By the way, they also had a very low protein diet arm. They just couldn't succeed in that because people got malnourished. I will show you another study, which is very recent, that had an ingenious way of overcoming that. So very low protein diet also works really, really well. Hold that thought though. Now, why does this matter? Because the number needed to treat was anywhere between 2 to 56. If you just treated just a few of your patients on a low protein diet, you can have such a dramatic reduction in their risk of going on to dialysis and their risk of developing kidney disease that progresses and death. Now, in non-diabetics, what happens? Same thing, low protein diet, 33% reduction. Insulin-dependent diabetics, 44% reduction in protein in the urine. How cool is that? By giving them low protein. By the way, I see so many doctors tell their patients, you know, Mr. Smith, you're spilling a lot of protein in the urine. Go eat more protein. That's wrong, right? I know it makes intuitive sense. You're losing, so you got to fill it, but it's not like your checking account. It doesn't work the same way. So you have to think differently about this. So, source. Source matters because if you give people animal protein versus non-animal protein, animal protein increases how much protein you spill. We don't understand the mechanism, but we do believe it has to do with net acid excretion. How much acid you put in your body, therefore how much acid you're kicking out through the kidneys. And if you switch it, you give somebody whole grains, what happens? You get the opposite effect. You get a dramatic reduction. So not only do you want to give them a low protein diet, what else do you want to do? You want to go ahead and make sure that the type of protein is plant-based, not animal-based. Then, what about looking at another source? So here we go. Looking at it in women specifically, what happens is if women get lots of animal protein, their rate of decline of kidney function. By the way, this is really interesting, and I know it sounds morbid, but we're friends, right? So I can say this. Do you know the moment you're born, like kidneys-wise, you're really dying, right? So you start off with about 1 million kidney cells in each kidney, and all that happens is we lose them. That's all that happens. So it's a race. Our job as nephrons or kidney specialists is to slow down the rate of kidney function decline. We can't stop it. That happens to everybody as we get older. So what we find is that on average, people's rate of kidney function decline may be about 0.5 or so in terms of GFR decline. But when you have kidney disease, it can be 1, 1.5, 2. And that's what we're trying to decline, is how fast your kidneys go down. Now, what happens with soy protein? Soy is actually remarkably beneficial for kidney disease. In fact, it is one of the best protein sources you can have if you have kidney disease. So when we look at it, what we find is if you have animal protein versus soy, with animal protein you actually have an increase in filtration rate. Why should you care? Don't you want more stuff to filter through the kidneys? The answer is actually no, because what happens is when you're a diabetic, what is the first thing that happens to your kidneys? Do they shrink or do they get larger? They actually get larger. And that doesn't mean it's because they're performing better. It means there's so much pressure, we call it hyperfiltration, but so much pressure that they start to get larger, 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 and then they start to die. And that's when the kidneys start to shrink. So if you do a kidney ultrasound on a patient and their kidneys are large and they're diabetic, that is the best time to intervene. That is the time you have to be extremely aggressive, not when their kidneys are already shrinking. Red meat and chronic kidney disease, same exact thing, right? Higher risk of kidney disease if you have highest amount of red meat. Same thing in total protein. If you got total protein, highest versus lowest total protein, or if you just look at red meat, you have a significantly higher risk of developing not just chronic kidney disease, but going on to kidney failure or dialysis. And then what's interesting is there's a lot of people who can't give up certain types of food. If they're not ready to change, what I do with them is I love B.J. Fogg's work on habits and how little steps make all the difference. So I always talk about just give me one serving less. One serving of red meat can have such a dramatic effect as far as lowering your risk goes. Now, I talked about very low protein diet. This was a remarkable study because in it, what they ended up doing was using an extremely low protein diet, 0.3 grams per kilogram per day, and they wanted to make sure these guys didn't get malnourished, so they gave them keto analogs of the essential amino acids. And this way, once the essential amino acids went in your body, they separated and you got your regular stuff. So they did not get malnourished. But what was interesting was endpoints were 50% reduction in kidney function or going on dialysis. And what did they find? The arm with the low protein diet, only 13% of them met the endpoint criteria versus the arm who was in the regular part where they were getting low protein but not the vegetarian side. So the very low protein arm, only 13%, the low protein arm, 42%. So what this tells you is not only does very low protein work better, but the type of protein makes a huge and substantial difference in all of this. And the number needed to treat was only about 5. Just 5 people. That's all it takes to put them on a vegetarian diet and to tell them just don't obsess about protein, and that's it. You don't have to say you need to eat exactly this many ounces. Listen, nobody cares. I've never seen a person at a restaurant take out a measuring scale and really measure, weigh how much they were eating. So nobody cares. All they will care about is simple advice. Don't obsess over protein. Type of protein matters. Stick to plant sources. Now, uremic toxins is what we worry about because those are the ones that cause all of this oxidative stress. And when you eat protein, your gut bacteria, once again, the gut microbiome, especially when it comes to kidneys, is huge. But the gut microbiome will go ahead and create these toxins. And what we find is in general, vegetarians have far lower rates of indoxyl sulfate, p-cressyl sulfate, than omnivores do. So if you have somebody on the verge of dialysis, what is one of the best things you can do right now is change what they eat. Carnitine, we know about carnitine, but what's interesting about carnitine, and I know speakers have already mentioned it, but here's the kidney twist. So carnitine, when it goes inside your gut, there's a sort of a middle of the pathway where you get gamma-butyrobutane, then you get trimethylamine, and then finally in your blood you get trimethylamine N oxide. TMAO is linked to things like heart failure, stroke, heart disease. But what people forget is it also causes your kidneys to fail faster. And what's fascinating about it is when you have increased amounts of TMAO inside your blood, for some reason the kidneys downregulate the clearance and they actually clear it out less. The more kidneys you have, the more kidney disease you have, the less TMAO you secrete out of the kidneys, which means the more it stays in your blood. It's a vicious cycle. And red meat, rich in carnitine, plays a huge part in all of this. Soy protein, we talked about this. It's a really elegant trial, but basically what they did was they took some of the animal protein versus plant-based protein, but then they took some of that animal protein and switched some of it with soy. So really the only thing that changed was soy protein, and what they found was remarkable. Remember, we use BUN, or blood urea nitrogen, as a marker of toxins that we can't measure, right? And so what we found was that there's this dramatic reduction in urea nitrogen, dramatic reduction in protein in the urine, and even their serum phosphorus went lower than it would have if you just did all vegetable protein. So soy protein actually makes a dramatic difference. Now saturated fat, everybody keeps talking about saturated fat. It's all over the news. You know, there's this study that everybody read called the PURE trial, which all of a sudden came out and said saturated fat is back. And if anybody has read the trial, you know how many issues we had with it. So the fascinating part is we say we don't have good data on saturated fat. We do. And the data is that your risk of albumin in the urine goes up dramatically. And if you reduce it, your cardiovascular events go down. Now, fiber, what's interesting about fiber is increase it. That's it. Your risk of albumin in the urine goes up dramatically. And the fascinating part is we say we don't have good data on saturated fat. We do. And the data is that your risk of albumin in the urine goes up dramatically. And if you reduce it, your cardiovascular events go down. Now, fiber, what's interesting about fiber is increase it. That's it. That's all there is. And if you increase it, your risk of kidney disease goes down dramatically. So what we know about fiber is that no matter how you look at it, eating more fiber matters. And by the way, everybody who's a big fan of things like the paleo diet and everything, listen, I think it's great to be paleo, but not the definition of paleo that people believe. So what's interesting is our ancestors were not hunters and gatherers. They were gatherers, and if they got lucky, they were hunters. That's number one. Number two is their average fiber intake was not our fiber intake of 10 grams. It was more like 80 to